Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Clinical Trials Network Best Practices Writing Series. I'm Rebecca Taff. I'm an editor with the Department of Communications here at DCRI, and today I'll be talking with you about writing medical manuscripts. Obviously, I can't teach you everything you need to know about writing in 1 hour, but what I hope to do is give you a formula and some tips for organizing a biomedical research paper that will help you approach the daunting task of writing, especially if you're a beginning writer. I think this will help you look at a blank page with a lot more confidence, perhaps. I always like to start with this quote by Robert Day, and I won't read all of it, but the basic premise is that a scientific experiment, no matter how spectacular the results, is not completed until the results are published. So basically, this is the cornerstone of the philosophy of science. What you do in your research must be authenticated, and that is, it needs to go through a peer review process and it needs to be shared. Otherwise, it's as if it didn't happen. So Robert Day says that it really has to be published to be added to the database that we call science. And I might add here that at DCRI, because we're in the business of doing clinical trials, we believe that even if your hypothesis doesn't turn out the way you expected, your research doesn't turn out the way you expected, maybe you get negative results, you still need to publish those because they contribute to the overall understanding and the overall database of science. And anyone who's out there doing similar research needs to know what didn't work as well as what did work. So it's not always a negative or a pejorative thing. It just adds to the knowledge for the medical community. So I want to give you some tools, and these are websites, and these slides will be archived, so if you don't have time to write these down, they will be available to you. But these are some tools that can help you get started in your writing, and we use these in our department quite regularly. If you're a beginning writer, they're extremely useful, but if you're an experienced writer, you can also find some important tips. The first one is the Uniform Requirements document, and here's the website. This was put together originally in 1978 by an international group of medical journal editors who decided that there needed to be some more uniformity to the way that scientific information was published. So they met in Vancouver, British Columbia, and it was a small group, maybe a dozen people, but they all represented some leading medical journals. And so they wrote these requirements, and over the years they've been updated, and especially I'd say in the last decade or so, since ethical considerations have become extremely important, they have updated them to add some ethical considerations for publishing as well as some statistical guidelines. So this is a real important document to get you started, and it will take you through all the steps that you need to know for writing a good paper. And I also should add that in the beginning, about 200 journals subscribed to this. That is, if you didn't follow their particular rules of style, but you followed uniform requirements, your paper would not be rejected on the basis of its style and format. So a lot of the journals I'm seeing today, because a lot more have jumped on the bandwagon, will say follow uniform requirements. It's also important if you don't have a target journal in mind and you're starting your writing process. This will help you get it going, and it will be pretty much acceptable. Another good website is from the Duke University Medical Center Library, and this one gives a whole list of reference sources, like the AMA style book and the CBE style book, now it's actually Council of Science Editors, sources that you may use to learn more about writing. Then there's the Consort Statement, which all of you are probably familiar with. If you're reporting the results of a clinical trial, this will give you all the guidelines that you need to include in your publication. And then there's journal instructions for authors. I can't emphasize enough how important it is when you choose a target journal to know what their requirements are. Because even if they say they follow uniform requirements, you can look at reference style and formatting and abstract style, and you'll see some preferential rules there that just apply to that journal. And it's really good in terms of just a psychological effect. When someone receives that paper in that journal office and they see it's exactly in the format that they require. So this website will take you right to the page for journals instructions for most of the major journals listed in Medline. And the website also has impact factors. You can look and see, if you're familiar with that, what a journal's impact factor is, and other, it'll take you to uniform requirements. So if you only have one website to choose, this is probably the one. Choosing a target journal is important when you begin writing. You want to determine, based on your own research, what types of manuscripts the journal will accept. Obviously, you want to send it to the right source. As I said, you want to be familiar with that journal style and format, and you want to read their instructions. So here are some guidelines for choosing a target journal. What is the reader interest? If you're a researcher, one way you can find out reader interest is just to ask your colleagues, how do you rank the journals in this field? If you're new to a field of research, this is certainly important. You want to publish your results of your trials in the best journals, obviously, but you don't want to waste time. So you want to find out what's most appropriate, what audience is most appropriate, and also what your peer group is reading. And then you want to find out what's the circulation of that journal. How many subscribers does it have? Is it widely read? Is it included in Index Medicus? That is the database for the National Library of Medicine. And if it's not included in Index Medicus, you won't get access to it online. So it's real important that it be there. And then what is its acceptance rate? If you're sending your manuscript to a major medical journal and they get 5,000 manuscripts a year, as a journal like Circulation does, it's not likely, the rate of acceptance is probably very low, but I'm not going to say it's not likely that your paper won't be accepted. It's just that you have to be realistic. Look at what the trends are. When I was first working in the field of cardiovascular medicine, I used to have a little more time than I do today to read journal articles. And I would look at the journals when I was helping someone choose a journal, and I would see what they were publishing in the last several months. And there really is a trend sometimes, and there are theme issues. And it's also good to establish a rapport with the journal. Their staff is there to help publish your research. And so journal editors that I've talked to and editors-in-chief are very willing to talk with you, to get letters from you, to get query letters about your research, because that's their business and they want to hear from you. So establish rapport with the journal. Look at the publication lag time. You can usually find this out in several ways. Sometimes you can contact the journal office directly, but I know that beginning writers and people who are just beginning to publish their research can't believe this, but the average publication lag time is about 7 months from the time you submit your paper until it's published, and sometimes it's as much as a year, depending on the peer review system. And we could spend an hour talking about peer review today, but that's generally, it's a blessing and a curse, but it's generally what holds up the publication. And then what is its impact factor? And that is basically how many times articles from that journal are cited in the general medical literature. So it shows what the average percentage is for readers. There are several types of manuscripts. When we're talking about the basic medical manuscript, the one I want to focus on today is the one that we primarily do here, and that is the clinical report, clinical study, or original research, reporting an analysis of data collected to answer a question. But there are also other types of articles, such as review articles, which give a general overview of a topic. There are special articles, which may be a consensus statement. Usually special articles are invited articles, and they may be written by a steering committee or an international group of experts or something along those lines. And then there are brief reports and case reports, and if you have those, I would say they're still important to publish, but a lot of journals, just because they don't have enough space to publish those over original research articles, they've stopped publishing them, so you need to look at the journals and see if they're still accepting those kinds of reports. Here's another quote by Robert Day that I'd like to share with you because I think it's important to be reminded, and the reason I put this in here is because as an editor, I can't tell you how many times over the years a beginning writer has come to me and said, I'm not a writer, I've got to do this paper. Dr. Smith wants me to write up this paper from his research, he's got all this data, but you know, I'm not a writer. And really, you know, you don't have to be a great writer, but you need to be a good organizer. And I always go back to my school days when, and I was an English major in college, but I hated doing outlines, I'll admit that. I just wanted to sit down and, you know, let this, the words flow, and I found out the hard way that, you know, an outline is a really good thing. So the preparation of a scientific paper has really less to do with literary skill than with organization. It's not literature, and that doesn't mean that it can't be a creative piece. But once you get the format down, and I'm going to share that with you today, once you know how to put the elements of your research in the order that they should be in, you've got the real backbone of a good paper. And so, and somebody like an editor, you know, can help you with the wording, but this is the real important thing. And Robert Day is a professor emeritus of English, so saying that is, I think that carries some weight, that he says, you know, it's not literature, and he's an expert in the scientific writing field. So here is how a biomedical manuscript should be structured. It should have these elements: a title, an abstract, and then what I call the backbone of the text, which is the introduction, methods and results discussion, then the references, figure legends, tables, and figures, and it's usually in that order that you present it. The purpose of the title is to state the topic and attract readers. And as I said yesterday, for those of you who were here for the presentation on abstracts, the abstract and the title are the two sections of your paper that will be read by most people. So when you think about adding a title at the end of your report and not giving much thought to it, think again. It's really important, as is the abstract. So here's some elements of an effective title. You want to get the reader's attention. It should be catchy. I mean, it can be catchy and still be a formal scientific title. It should use the keywords that are appropriate to the paper. Some journals will give you guidelines and will actually provide keywords for you to choose from that are appropriate for indexing. And so those should be included in the title. Don't use jargon, don't use abbreviations, be descriptive, and give some promise of what is to follow. You want to use appropriate words for the journal's audience. You don't want to use abbreviations that are not explained unless they're real common, like RNA and DNA. And in some of the sources I gave you at the beginning of today, there are actually guidelines for what abbreviations are acceptable. I've seen a lot of infractions, if you will, of that rule and just scanning the literature, but I would really stick to the rules on this one. You want to indicate something about the study design. And I guess I should add here, if you're doing an experimental study and you're using animals in your research, you want to put in your title what the species was, like if you used rats or rabbits or dogs or whatever. But if you're doing a clinical study, you don't need to say it was in humans. I mean, that's understood. So that's just one little tip for you. And also, this is my rule. Use study acronyms to facilitate literature searches. I just recently had, not an argument, but let's just say a disagreement with one of the writers I was working with about whether we could spell out the acronym CRUSADE in the title of his manuscript. And he was just insistent that it be spelled out. I see Aaron looking at me. But really, when someone is familiar, and most people who are researching in a certain field are going to be familiar with the study acronyms, they're going to search to that acronym and not a word that's in the acronym. So it's really for a practical reason that we use acronyms in titles, even though it may seem to go against the rule I just gave you about using abbreviations. For instance, GUSTO, everyone pretty much knows the GUSTO trial. You wouldn't search for global if you're looking for a GUSTO paper. So just keep that in mind when you're writing titles. And it also makes a title so cumbersome and long and uninteresting to spell out something. Certainly you want to spell out that acronym somewhere in the manuscript, but not in the title. And then don't give conclusions. There are some exceptions to this rule, and I would say the exceptions are when maybe you're publishing something that is of great import and it needs to be published in a timely way, and you want people to know what you found. It's a spectacular new finding about a drug's effect or something, then you might put the conclusion or what you found in the title. But otherwise, I think you want to keep some interest and get the reader to go further and go beyond the title to read your paper. And I won't go through all of these, but these are the kinds of phrases that editors cross out day after day because they're not necessary. So really look at these, keep these in mind, and don't be too wordy in your title. Give real exact words and keywords and keep it to that. And I would say that a title is so important that you should probably write it at the outset, revisit it and revisit it again to make sure it's appropriate, because if your paper appears on Medline and maybe the abstract doesn't get published with it, that title is all someone's got to go on, so you want it to be good. Here's some examples of titles that can be written that were written for the same manuscript. And I give these just as an example of showing you that you can make the emphasis what you want it to be based on what your research is showing. So the first one is emphasizing anorexia nervosa in adolescents. The second one is really looking at mineral balance and bone turnover. And the third one is looking at characterizing bone turnover, and it's downplaying anorexia. So it really depends on what your emphasis is in your research, where the emphasis lies in the title. Sorry. And then here are some examples I just pulled out of a file I have on medical manuscripts and ethical considerations in publishing, and I think these are kind of fun. I especially like the one a manuscript editor's wish list, or go ahead and make my day, please. Sponsorship, authorship, and a tale of two media. Sometimes, depending on the subject matter, you can make your title fun, and it really will attract someone to read that article. The title page is really specific and unique to every journal. And these are some of the elements that a title page nearly always contains. Obviously, the title, and then the author's names and their degrees, what the funding source was for the research, and especially the address for the corresponding author. You want to give all the information you can so that the journal can contact the person who's in charge of that paper. And here's an example of a title page. It's kind of scrunched up here, but I just wanted to give you an example of what it should look like. And I guess as an editor, I have a little pet peeve about this. I often get manuscripts, and I know it's part of our work to make them kind of look pretty, but a lot of times writers don't pay attention to their title page, and they'll put a title in the same font, in the same size font that they put all the other elements. But a title should really be prominent, and it should be in boldface, and it should really stand out. So if I could give you one rule about just uniformity and style in title pages, that would be it. The Mrad formula is what editors have been using. Actually, this has been in use for several years. It's an acronym that we use to describe really the backbone of the text of a paper. And I wanted to give you some background into how Mrad, the acronym, came about. It really has been around for quite some time, and some people credit the Mrad development with the work of Cook and Pasteur in the late 19th century, because Louis Pasteur actually was putting out the germ theory of disease at that time, and he had a lot of adversaries who were trying to refute his research. They just didn't believe that, and I'm not really emphasizing the research here, but just to tell you what he did that made this formula work. He wrote his experiments in such exquisite detail that they could be replicated by any other scientist, and they would come up with the same findings. And if I can tell you anything important about writing biomedical research today, that would be it. Use that premise. Write your results, write your findings, write your experimental methods in such detail that they can be repeated, and so they can't be refuted. And so that's what Pasteur did, and he wrote in sort of this formula. And so some credit him with really starting this Mrad formula, but it was not until about the mid-20th century, around the time after World War II, that publishing became more of a business, I would say. And that's because a lot of different drugs were developed during the war, like penicillin. Well, penicillin was developed before, but it was used a lot then. And so people began publishing research about these new drugs that were developed in wartime. And then the space age came about, and we started kind of a contest with the Russians to see who could, get to the moon first. And so science and technology really exploded around that time. And with that, there became a lot of funding from the government put into research. And so journal editors were just overwhelmed with papers being submitted to them. And they decided at that time, and this is well before uniform requirements came about, that there needed to be some standard. So a scientific body, I have it written here somewhere, a scientific group adopted it. The American National Standard for the Preparation of Scientific Papers is an organization that really became the proponent of Mrad, and they published their work in 1972. And so that's really when Mrad became a formal kind of background for scientific writing, and people started to follow it. And then, of course, it was in 1978, just a few years later, that uniform requirements came about. And it's also interesting if you look at the history of scientific writing to see how these developments came about, because I think those of us who started in the field just recently or a few years ago take a lot for granted. But you can actually see a lot about the history of medicine if you look at the history of publishing, obviously. And if you have some time, I used to hang out in libraries a lot because I'm old enough that I didn't always have electronic databases at my disposal. And so I would actually go and look up references, and I would go in the catacombs of the library and look at old sources and find original papers for the doctors I was working with to read. And I would often look at journals that had been published for many years, like the New England Journal of Medicine, and it is really fun. I have to say, I can say this with all honesty, it's fun to read those papers because they're really descriptive and they're really narratives. And it's really before, I guess I can say this, before medicine became a real science, because they didn't really have all the technology they needed. I mean, doctors will talk about making house calls, you know, and bedside cardiology. You know, I felt the patient's head, felt like he had a temperature, things like that. It's really kind of fun to read. So we've come a long way in our organization. I won't go into detail about abstracts because there's an archived slide set about this from yesterday. But the abstract is really based on this Mrad format as well. And you can write an abstract if you can answer these 4 questions. Why was the study done? What was done? What was found, and what does it mean? And the why of the study is the hypothesis. And I have to say here that your hypothesis for your research is the part of the biomedical paper that everything hinges on. In other words, you need to make, both in the abstract and in the introduction to your paper, you need to make your purpose clear. Why did you set out to do this research? Why is it worthwhile? And every other part of the paper will support that. What did you do to find it? What did you do to prove your hypothesis or the question of your study? What did you find? And then what does it mean? And this is really the paper, if you can answer these questions. And so this just shows you where Mrad falls in the structure of the biomedical manuscript. Today I'm going to use some excerpts from a manuscript that was published from one of our research groups, the Primary Care Consortium, and Rowena Dolar was the first author of this paper. It was published by JAMA a few years ago, and it's the first publication of the CAS trial, which is a comparison of cefuroxime and with intranasal fluticasone for treatment of rhinosinusitis. I thought this was maybe an appropriate topic to use at this time of year, but I also think this is a really well-written manuscript, and I took some excerpts from it just to show you examples of how to write the different sections of a manuscript. So when you start with the introduction, this is the question or problem of the study. And there are 3 purposes to this section. 1, you want to orient the reader to your field and capture the reader's interest. Briefly present the findings of others you will develop or challenge. And then finish with presenting the hypothesis your paper will address. In writing the introduction, you use a funnel type of organization. What you want to do is present what is known and unknown that leads to the question of your study. So you want to put your research in context, and that means not writing everything you know about that subject. Say you're writing a paper where you're comparing 2 types of stents. You don't write the history of interventional cardiology. You just want to start with something about stents and why they work and why they don't, and whether they're good or bad, and then lead the reader through. What is the scope of this problem? Why did I research this particular stent? And what is the gap in knowledge? What is not known about it that I'm going to find out for you? What has been found in the past? And what method of investigation are you going to use to answer your question? And then you lead them to the question of your research. And if you are familiar with the format of medical papers, remember this. If someone's looking for the question of your research, it should always appear at the very end, either the last paragraph or the last statement in an introduction. If someone's looking for it, they'll look for it there. And this will lead you right into your methods section. So here's an example from Dr. Dolores' paper, Investigations of whether intranasal corticosteroids promote resolution of symptoms and prevent recurrences of sinusitis have yielded conflicting results. Previous studies involving small cohorts of patients with chronic sinusitis or polyposis showed a trend toward improvement in patients who received corticosteroids, but they were underpowered to show an effect on clinical outcome. Overall, none of the previous studies unequivocally proved the efficacy or justified the routine use of nasal corticosteroids in sinusitis. So here they've set up the problem. The problem is no one has unequivocally proved that these drugs are really effective, and the reason is the studies have been too small to really show significance. So when you set up the question of your study, you want to actually signal the reader because it's written in a paragraph format. So you want to use phrases, transitional phrases or terms to lead the reader into the question. Therefore, we tested the hypothesis that, or the purpose of this study was to show X. So here they've led to the research question in this paper. We assessed the effectiveness of fluticasone propionate nasal spray in combination with cefuroxime in acute rhinosinusitis in a diverse population of patients. Cefuroxime has been shown to be effective in the treatment of acute bacterial sinusitis. We examined whether the addition of fluticasone to cefuroxime could affect the speed and rate of recovery in patients with rhinosinusitis. So what they're doing is looking at these steroids, knowing that they're pretty effective, and they're adding a nasal spray to the regimen for patients who have had chronic problems. So they're adding a little, this is the gist of their study, they're adding a little extra drug to the regimen to see if these patients do better. So the introduction should be about 2 pages, and that is 2 pages of double-spaced type. You can usually dispense with putting a title introduction there, as journals don't use it. You want to use the present tense, and I will probably repeat this later, but the only section of your paper in which you use past tense should be the methods section, because that's what you did, that's in the past, and that's already done. Otherwise, you want to talk as if things, you're talking about it now, and this is what is known, this is what is happening, this is what we believe. But when you state the research question, which is also part of the methods, you always put that in past tense. So on to the materials and methods. How did you study the problem? Well, you want to give the reader everything you can think of about how you did that study to let them replicate the study if they need to. And so you want to list whether you use chemicals, whether you use cell lines, whether you used human subjects. You want to say how the preparation was done, what drugs were used, whether you had institutional review board approval, how you set up the statistical section of your research. And I should probably add here that anytime you're doing a clinical trial, you need to have a statistician involved with you in that from the very beginning. And one of the important reasons is they can tell you how many subjects you'll probably need to establish significance, because as I'll show you later, if you're using human subjects and you're doing a randomized study, a lot of them are going to be lost to follow-up or drop out before you even get to the actual study. And a statistician will tell you what kinds of analysis need to be done, what kinds of data need to be gathered, and that sort of thing. So you want to explain that in your materials and methods. The other thing I should say about this section is, if you are starting a scientific study and you have a protocol, which you absolutely should have, and we have a presentation coming up on writing protocols, you can write the methods section of your manuscript before you do the study. So it shouldn't be so hard to write a manuscript when you think about all the tools at your disposal. The other thing that I should add about methods section is, from everything I've read and everyone I've talked to who works with peer review, the methods section is the one reason most manuscripts get rejected. If it's too short, if it's 2 pages, they're going to say, they didn't think this through. They didn't give us all the details. You write as much as necessary to explain what you did. It should be the real weight. It should carry the weight of the text. So you want to summarize your study design and protocol, describe the patients and setting, and include methods that you use to implement the randomization process in a clinical trial. You want to describe the interventions or treatment, what you did to answer the question of your research, what were the primary and secondary outcomes or endpoints of the study, and what statistical methods did you use to analyze the data. You want to write in a logical order. Say you're doing a laboratory experiment. You usually do a chronological series of tests, so you write those out, and that's what you put in your paper. If you're doing a clinical study, it might be that you're looking at the most important thing you did, following with the other less important things you did to study the research question. As I mentioned, you want to write in past tense but use active voice, and provide signals to lead the reader through that, because the methods section, though it needs to be detailed and thorough, can be the dullest reading in that paper. So you want to lead your reader through what you did to find the answer to your question. And then, of course, you want to use appropriate figures and tables. And I wish I could go into more detail about these, because you can really improve the writing and the presentation of a biomedical paper if you use tables and figures to their fullest advantage. And that is, include a lot of the data in tables if the journal allows tables, and then just provide a few statements about what's significant about that data. And if you're working with statisticians, as we all do, they may send you a printout of all the data from a certain area of study. Well, you don't necessarily need to use all of it, but as the scientist looking at the question, you need to see what is most relevant and what is most important to present. And of course, you don't want to include results in the methods section. This is another flaw that we often see. Someone gets so excited about saying what they did, they write what they found before they get to the right section. So here's an excerpt from the CAFS trial. The CAFS trial was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study designed to determine the effectiveness of a 10-day course of cefuroxime combined with a 3-day treatment with xylometazoline, with or without a 21-day course of fluticasone in patients with acute rhinosinusitis. Very long sentence, but detailed enough to tell you exactly what they did in this study. And obviously, if you take this and try to glean from it some words that may not be necessary, it's hard to find. So sometimes a long sentence is okay. Also, they describe the patients and setting in great detail, and this is just an excerpt, but there's much more detail in the paper. You want to say what the inclusion criteria were for the patients you used in the study. Here they said they had to be at least 18 years old. They had to have a previous history of chronic sinusitis that necessitated antibiotic therapy, because what they're looking at in this study is whether the addition of another drug will improve their symptoms. And then you want to say where you chose the study, where you chose the subjects for the study, what the study sites were, give that in detail as well. And then describe the interventions or treatment. And this describes in detail exactly what they gave to the patients. And this is the section that editors probably spend more time on than any in really verifying the facts. I can give a little anecdote here. I was working in the field of oncology some years ago, and I was looking at a manuscript where they were looking at a chemotherapy regimen for patients with a type of gynecologic cancer. And I looked in all my source books to make sure that the dosage they were giving for each of these drugs was appropriate or within a normal range. And I found that had they given what they listed in the manuscript, it would have been a fatal dose. So I called the researcher and I said, you know, Dr. Eggs, I am looking at your paper, and these drug dosages seem really high. And he was one of the sort of leaders in that field, and he said, well, I know you're looking at a good source there, but he said, you know, we're experimenting with some of these drugs, and we have found in the last year or so that we can give much higher dosages of this drug, and it actually works better in these patients, and they tolerate it with fewer side effects than we thought. So in that case, it was fine. But you need to make sure as a writer or an editor that the amounts that you give, because somebody out there, once this is authenticated, to use Robert Day's word, somebody out there may be giving their patients the exact thing that you're suggesting here, and you want to make sure that those numbers are exact and correct and clear. And when we were working on this paper, you know, we had to say, we put 2 puffs of nasal spray in each nostril. I mean, you have to be that specific. So just think about that. Then you want to list the primary and secondary outcome measures. And I think that's pretty clear. The materials and methods section, as I said, should be as long as necessary to describe what you did. Enough detail to permit replication. And you want to assume that the reader is a trained investigator with considerable experience. In other words, you don't need to explain things like you're talking to a third grader, but someone who's in your peer group. Then what were the findings? Although this looks like a bolt of lightning, it's really a graph, and I guess it's kind of appropriate either way. You want to report results that answer the question of the study. Be sure for every result given there's a method that's described before it. And I would say that the way you present your methods section, you should just mirror your results section on that. If you list your experiments in chronological order, you should list your results in chronological order. And so just make it a mirror of the method section and you'll be in good shape. Ensure that it's logical, that you don't leap off into some conclusion or go off on a tangent because you think it's interesting. Really stick to what you found and point out findings you will develop later in the discussion. As I mentioned, you want to use figures and tables liberally if you can, but don't repeat the data in the text. Just repeat why they're important, or just say why they're important, and let the data speak for themselves. This is kind of crowded, but I just wanted to show you from the CAPS trial how they how they illustrated with this patient flow chart the random allocation sequence of their study. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important to work with a statistician because you may start out, as they did, with screening about 500 patients, and you end up with 44 and 45 in the two treatment arms of the study by the time you find how many are not eligible and how many drop out and some refuse to be in the trial and so on. So this is a good way to display how you allocated patients to the study. And I don't want to go into detail about this either, but I just want to say that it's important to put the baseline characteristics in a clinical research study somewhere in your paper. And in this trial, there was nothing remarkable about the comparison between the two treatment arms. So what they did, the authors did here, is just say that how many received one treatment and how many received the other to show that they were equally proportioned. And then they said that more than half the subjects were enrolled from primary care and equally from primary care and otolaryngology practices in each treatment arm. And this was important to show that there were not only specialists caring for the patients, but there were some from primary care, so that it was an equal allocation. What did the findings mean? This is the answer. This is what the discussion involves. You've done all this research, you've set up a hypothesis, you've done your research, and now you're looking at, whereas you set up in the introduction some studies that led you to the question, now you're going to look at your results in comparison with what's been done before and see where they could be meaningful. So this is really not very complex. It's really a simple thing, but the discussion should have three parts: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Easy enough. In the first paragraph of your discussion, you want to answer the question of your study. Here's what everyone's looking for. You know, they've treaded through all these sections of the paper, and now they want to find out what it is that you think it means, what your findings mean, and then what they mean in the context of what is already known. In the end, you want to restate the answer to your study and give a conclusion, either implications or speculation if it's appropriate, and leave the reader with a very firm statement of what your research means. So, in the beginning of this discussion, you signal the reader to the answer. I'm going to show you an example of this later. Be sure that conclusions are supported by the results and methods, and give the strongest result first. What was the primary endpoint, and what did you find, and what does it mean? So here I've shown another two excerpts from the CAF study. This is a statement on the left from the introduction, and it's, again, they signal the reader to the question of the research. We examined whether addition of fluticasone to cefuroxime could affect the speed and rate of recovery in patients with rhinosinusitis. In the beginning of the discussion, they answer the question. We found that patients with sinusitis were more likely to achieve clinical improvement when treated with fluticasone and cefuroxime than with the one drug alone. So, very concrete answer to the question. In the middle of the discussion, you might want to go into some more interpretation of the results. And here they say that they speculate about why symptom response was better in their patients, because what they're trying to do here is anticipate what a peer reviewer is going to ask. You know, they're going to say, well, you know, you use this other, this acetyl, whatever other hydrochloride solution they use. Maybe that's why the patients did better, because it reduced the nasal congestion. And so you want to, in your discussion, anticipate anything that might not pass muster in peer review. and answer that or speculate about it. So that's what they've done here. And that's why you see words like this may have been or this might have been, because you don't really know, but you're certainly adding to the database of knowledge for this area. And you can't say for sure if you don't know. So this is appropriate. And then they say the most important aspect of early treatment may have been adequate drainage to reduce nasal congestion, whatever they did in their study. Then you, of course, want to compare your work with that of others. And here they make some important points. Our study was able to show clinical benefit with shorter courses of antimicrobial treatment. This is very important in terms of the patient's compliance, the patient's willingness to try a drug regimen with cost and everything, because they show, and they not only improved symptoms, but they did it in a shorter time course. So that's important to point out here. And they're comparing what they did with other studies that have been done. So also describe the limitations of the study in the discussion. Sometimes this section is there in bold with a subheading because it's really important. Every research study has some limitations, and if you leave that out, peer reviewer is going to jump on it and say, I think this was limited because of X, Y, and Z. So again, anticipate and know what the limitations are and let them know up front. But don't end your discussion with the limitations. I've seen this over and over. It's like the researcher gets through this beautifully written paper and then says, oh, you know what, there were some limitations, I better add that. And they add it at the end, and that leaves your reader with this idea that the study was limited or flawed or whatever, and it doesn't leave you with a strong conclusion. So here they said, we use diaries and reports from patients, so the findings may have been subjective, but in talking with the researchers about this, and they made a good point, they told me, they said, well, it may have been subjective, but the patients, when we called them in follow-up, said they felt better, and isn't that what you're looking for ultimately? So, but they did put that in their limitations. So if there's something you found that was unexpected, you want to point that out. Speculation, if it's appropriate. Be certain there's a basis for any speculation. And then write a very strong conclusion. And mention the need for future work if it's appropriate. So here from the CAPS trial, they say, in conclusion, and they're signaling the reader that they're about to give them their big conclusion to the study. Our study supports the use of corticosteroids with antimicrobial therapy for the treatment of acute paranasal sinusitis in patients with a history of recurrent sinusitis or chronic rhinitis. Then they give a recommendation. They recommend, and this is a very strong conclusion, that treatment guidelines for these patients be amended to include this regimen. That gives a lot of weight to their study. And then they say there's a little caveat, they may look at the duration of the therapy and decide that it needs to be changed. But otherwise, they feel strongly that what they've done and what they've found is worth giving to the medical community. The recommended length of a discussion should be about 2 pages, the same as an introduction, maybe a little longer. Another flaw that I see in a lot of reports is that the researcher gets so excited about the results that they repeat them again in the discussion, but you don't need to repeat the results. The reader just read the results. You just need to say why they're important. And repeat certain terms or certain aspects of the results only if they support the sentence. So I want to give you just a few writing tips. We have about 5 minutes for writing tips. And I want to give you some examples, but just to leave you with the thought that and I hope I've gotten this across, ambiguity is the worst error in medical writing. You want to be clear and concise, and you don't want to have the reader have any doubt about what your drug regimen is, what you did, how you chose patients, anything. And a lot of sentences are written sentences that I read in these papers at first draft especially are written in a way that I'm just confused. And so if I'm confused, I feel like maybe that experienced, trained medical researcher out there reading it is going to be confused too. So just write clearly and concisely, and then in a coherent way. Don't be too wordy. Try to limit your sentences to about 22 words, and you'll be in good shape. And keep the tone appropriate for the study. I think we all know what that means. Just if it's a formal research paper, it should be written in that way. If it's a more engaging, fun kind of editorial, it should be, the tone should be appropriate. Here are some examples of statements I got from the Journal of Emergency Nursing on an article they wrote, and they were talking about how they received a lot of papers that just had these laughable sentences in them. So I just put this caveat, think before you write. This came from an actual manuscript they received. We treat patients at a time when they seem most susceptible to decay. And then treatment was to no avail and the patient disappeared. I assume the patient was lost to follow-up, but At death 14 weeks later, 10 animals were alive. I'm still not sure what that means. When you're writing, think about writing your every section of your paper in concise, clear paragraph format. When you change a topic or a thought, then you probably need to move to another paragraph. And even having read articles for years, I sometimes have trouble knowing when to separate things, but I should say that if you have a colleague who can read your paper, if you're not working with an editor, have someone read it and help you with that, because I think having concise paragraphs with signaling topics to lead a reader through each section really makes a more readable paper. And again, we could spend some time on paragraphs, but I'll just say that you want to get a certain message across in a paragraph. You want to keep one thought to a sentence, one idea to a paragraph. You want to keep it fairly short, less than 100 words. You want to organize your ideas in a logical way and make the relationship between the sentences clear. And then emphasize what the important ideas are. Every paragraph should have a topic sentence, and every sentence after that should support it. That's one good way to think about it. So use key terms, and this is simplistic, but it's true. Use a verb with a subject and a completer. Don't use sentence fragments. Write details to support your topic sentence and organize them in a logical way. And then I want to say just a few words about references. I mentioned the Uniform Requirements Rules, and often this group that put those together is called the Vancouver Group. So the reference format that they use is sometimes called the Vancouver System, and that is the one that we use primarily in almost all the journals that we submit to. So you don't have to worry too much about the author year system. And I think you all probably know the difference between these. The Vancouver system is when you have numerical listing of references in the body of the text, and you have a corresponding reference in the reference list, whereas in the Harvard system, which a lot of textbooks still use, you list the author and the year of the publication in the text, and you list the authors alphabetically at the end of the text. So that's the difference. But just look at the journal's rules and see what they prescribe, and you'll be fine with the references. If you're writing, you might want to insert references, and I usually, if I'm writing something, I use an author date style just to get it going. You want to not list too many abstracts, and you want to make sure, because, and I say that because some journals actually don't accept abstracts as legitimate references. So just look at their rules and see if that is the case. And then, of course, the ultimate style depends on the journal. And you don't even have to read their instructions. You can just look at a sample and see which style they're using. A caveat: never quote a reference you have not read, because, and I can tell you this happens more than you'd like to think, I have had to do fact-checking for manuscripts in the past. Sometimes I will go to what I consider a secondary source. Say you're reading a review article and you find 5 references that support a statement, and you go, okay, I need to list those in my manuscript. So you copy them down, but you haven't actually read them. Sometimes the statement that those are supposedly supporting is not exactly accurate. In other words, there may be, and I'm not saying that researchers and writers are flawed in this way routinely. It just happens when you're busy. And sometimes you will cite a source from someone you respect, but they cited it from someone else who was wrong. You know, these mistakes get, does that make sense? They get perpetuated. So if you're writing an important research paper and you don't even think you have time, take time to look at the original sources that you're citing. And what makes it easier these days is that a lot of journals will limit the number of references you can use, so that makes your job a little easier. Some people use RefMan to make formatting simple, but journals will request if you use RefMan or EndNotes that it be taken out, the formatting, before you submit, because they take most submissions electronically now, and that really messes up their system of transferring it. So just keep that in mind. Tables should all have titles. You should define all the abbreviations at the end of the table, present data that's relevant to the analysis, and keep them simple. If you're comparing data, make sure it reads down and not across. Provide enough information that the meaning of the data is apparent without reference to the text, and limit the number of tables depending on what the journal requires. Today, laser prints are usually acceptable. I still get calls from people saying, do we need to have glossy prints of this figure to submit to the journal? And I'm always saying, well, that journal either has not updated their author's instructions in a long time, or they're really out of date, because laser prints are usually the way to go, because most of all the elements of a manuscript are submitted electronically anyway. So keep that in mind, but do work with a qualified graphics artist to make your figures look professional. Make sure if you borrow something from another source, you get permission. And permission is really easy to get these days, because you can usually find in the author's instructions, you can click on an email address and ask for permission and get it quite readily. And most publishers even accept electronic permission statements now. In the past, you had to have it stamped, and it almost had to be notarized to go through and pass muster, but that's not true today. And then, of course, when in your figure legends, you want to also define your abbreviations that appear and identify the data that are being displayed. Just a few words about ethical considerations. I'll go through these quickly. I wanted to spend a lot more time on this because it's really important. There's a lot of good literature out there. If you just search on Medline to ethics and publishing, you'll find a lot of good sources for this. But the ones that are most important, I think, for beginning and even experienced writers to know, I've listed here. And those are, be sure that you, as an author, fulfill the authorship criteria. And that That's listed in uniform requirements and in most authors' instructions for journals these days. And the criteria for authorship, there are really several main things. But one is that you should have participated in the research. Maybe you were a site investigator, or you were the main or principal investigator, but you should have participated in the research. Or if you're a statistician, you should have participated in the statistical design. You should have read the paper and at least read the final draft and made comments on it. And you should have probably participated in the writing and the intellectual content in some way. So those are the basic criteria for authorship. And most journals will have you sign a form saying that you and your co-authors are legitimate authors and fulfill the criteria. And all this came about because people used to tack on names of anybody who walked through a laboratory, you know, to help them get tenure or a lot of publications to their name or whatever. And that's just not happening anymore, hopefully. Fraud is just, I think we all know what that is, just making up something, fabricating data and putting it in your paper, maybe fudging the results or something. And it's been done quite a few times, and you can read about quite a few notorious authors of the past, some of whom were, I would say, real promising researchers, but maybe for whatever reason, they decided that they needed to get a lot more publications, and they went this route, and it's a career-ruining thing to do. And this is also tied to authorship because I can think of some examples of fraud in the past wherein a leading maybe head of a department at Harvard or somewhere, shall we say, was involved and did not really participate in the writing of the paper and had to then go back and defend himself against the allegations of fraud. So just be careful to make everything accurate and right. Don't plagiarize or copy anything. Don't try to publish the same paper twice. This is basically what duplicate publication means. If you have a financial conflict of interest with any company that represents any product that's listed in the paper, then you need to disclose that. Say you're on a speakers bureau for a company and you're writing a paper and that company produces that product, you need to disclose that. And it's better, I know Dr. Califf has a disclosure list about this long because as the Chief Executive Officer of DCRI, any of the funds that we receive, any of the sponsors who support us, he considers to have some affiliation with in that regard. So he just lists all of them. And I'd say that's the way to go. They're not going to reject your paper because you do that. They just want to know and want to make it clear if there could be any conflict so that the audience and the reader is aware. That's all. It's just really a formality these days. It's not anything to be concerned about. And then, of course, you want to keep the privacy of the subjects, the patients that are in your study. You want to keep that. You want to be respectful of that and keep things confidential. Of course, if you use pictures, you want to make sure you get permission. And then make sure you follow the HIPAA requirements, which we're all familiar with. In summary, I just want to give you some overall tips for writing. Before you write a scientific paper, read. Read some papers in your field. Read the papers your mentors write. Make sure you follow a logical order when you're writing. Be clear and concise. Be accurate. Get to the point quickly and stick to it. Cite only relevant references, only relevant figures and tables, and use standard abbreviations and be consistent. And I want to share with you some sources that I've used in the last several years that I think are really excellent in addition to the websites that I gave you originally. And one is Robert Day's paper, which is being updated and will be out in 2006, How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper. It's an excellent resource. Daniel Burns' book, Publishing Your Medical Research Paper, and I think the subtitle is What They Don't Teach in Medical School. And then Mimi Zeiger's book, Essentials of Writing Biomedical Research Papers, which is also an excellent source. And one reason I recommend her book is because she's a teacher of writing, and she actually gives tests throughout to let you test yourself and see if you've really learned. It's almost like a CME guide. So thanks, everyone. I went a little over time. I apologize for that. If you have questions, I'll take those now.